All right then. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I see in the room we have a few people. I can see a Flora, Jaden, Lequan, and Angelo. So I just want to say good morning to you, or good afternoon, I should say. My name is Blaine Robin. I've worked for a number of years with Darren in the sector of education, and we both have a passion for civil society, social justice, and the vehicle that democracy can offer hope for fairness and equity across the board. I sincerely believe that's what we hold dear to ourselves. I'm a senior lecturer at Leeds Beckett University, where I teach occupational therapy. That's my professional discipline. And I lead on a module called Promoting Occupational Justice. So that's what I do now. And in that role, it's allowed me to look at the problems in society and to ask ourselves as social scientists, health professionals, scholars, even young politicians like yourselves doing A levels, etc. What can be done to address these things on a macro level? That's like globally, looking at what the United Nations have to say about issues of inequity, and other global organizations like UNESCO and the World Federation of my governing body. We look at the meso constructs, i.e. what's happening here at a government level that interprets those macro issues. Climate change, for example, and climate injustice is a big theme that has moved from the macro meso down to the individual level, whereby you and me are affected at the ground level. If we can think about the way the world resources is being used up, that's a real injustice. And at an individual level, what are we doing to impact our local government, political decision makers, to put things right as best as possible in terms of a sustainable footing? So these are sort of the essence of my activism at this stage in the higher education sector. I was born and bred in northwest London, in the London borough of Brent. My parents would be regarded as the Windrush generation. They came here from the Caribbean in the 1950s, along with swathes of other people from the former British colonies of the Caribbean. Post-war Britain meant that politicians in this country had a workforce problem. And that workforce problem emerged out of the back of the fighting and defeating a real global enemy, fascism and Nazism. We did that as a world. It wasn't a white war fought by the Brits only. It was the world, the global collective, global North, global South, and all the empire coming together to defeat that. And so Britain had a problem here. In the chat, what do you think that problem was? Why people like my parents had to come here? Now, Darren, if you could just read anything that comes in the chat, I'd really greatly appreciate that.
So anyone want to answer that? Just had somebody arrive in the room. Can you just say that again, Blaine?
Yes. Post-war Britain, my parents came here from the Caribbean. They were invited here as British subjects, and there was a problem post-war. We just defeated a global enemy, fascism, Nazism, and it took a real global effort. Many of us might have relatives who fought in that war, but as I said earlier on, it wasn't just a white version of British success. It was a global effort. So I'm asking what were the factors that led to that? And it looks like we've got some answers coming in. Darren, can you read them out, please?
So Angelo said a labour shortage. And Jaden also, in addition to that as well, reconstruction after the Second World War.
This is absolutely brilliant. Well done, both of you. And requests were made by the government and various employers. Let's reach out to the Commonwealth, or it was called the Empire at the time. Let's reach out to those dominions that we own. Yes, folks, Britain owned a lot of the world. Don't know if they bought those countries in a shop. It's me being rather, but they owned the world. That may be another side topic. They owned a lot of places, and they reached out to their subjects across the empire. We're talking about, let's start with places like Australia. Let's move across the world to India, Pakistan. Let's look at Africa and nations in the Caribbean. Please, please come to Britain. Come to the mother country, because we need you to help us rebuild. And that led to my parents coming here. And so they came as young people, probably your age. My dad was 19 when he arrived in 1957, and he had an uncle here who was here before him, Uncle Marcus from Southeast London. That's where he lived, in Lee. And on my dad's ship, it was called the Escania. The Escania docked in Southampton, and half a dozen men from the village of Wesley in Dominica came to stay with relatives in this exciting period of adventure. And how did they come? Well, they scraped together whatever money they could. My dad had a small garden, that's what they call it, but imagining 3 or 4 allotment-sized pieces of land in the Caribbean, where all that generation did was plant and sell their produce for a living, if they could get it sold. There was no, Sainsbury's or Asda or any of these shops. You basically were subsistence farmers. You ate what you grew. And so these young people came here, probably with less than a fiver in their pocket equivalent. They came for an adventure, came for an ambition to work hard, save their money, and do great things. My dad's first job was a cleaning job, and at that time, a lot of the work was manual work. And many Caribbean folk were joined by other members of the Commonwealth, or the Empire, I should say, across the world, people from Cyprus, people from Southern Ireland. I say that distinctively, and I'm sure at some point Darren will let you know, if he hasn't done already, about Southern Ireland. And they came here to do the work that there wasn't enough of locals to do. There was a population problem, and so political action, politicization of migration brought my parents' generation here. Kind of interesting, isn't it? And when they arrived in places like Southampton, he took a train with his cousins and friends, and they arrived at Waterloo. And that was a welcome hub for many people. The other central location would have been Tilbury, where the SS Windrush, a Nazi boat, which was commandeered by Britain, used to to ship migrants from around the Caribbean and bring them to Tilbury, Essex. And those young people came looking really, fine and dandy. And you've seen many documentaries about them, and they arrived here. So again, it wasn't plain sailing, because many people in Parliament began to debate how sustainable it was to have migrants arriving in Britain. There were some politicians that welcomed them, and believe it or not, people from the right of the political hue that we know, otherwise known as the Conservatives, as well as the left, they had mixed welcome, if you like, and campaigned for settlement, for housing, for options, for opportunity. that's my background context, which I'm ever so proud of. And I think it's important for me to sow the seeds, because it's out of that occupational volition and drive and habituation. You've heard of that concept, this idea that my parents decided to make norms of success and work ethic and happiness, their locus, their drive, their positionality. My mum arrived in 1959, age 16, and she stayed with a god sister. And she arrived day one, day two, she was working in a wimpy at the time. And then the word on the ground is she then went to the Labour Exchange, the unemployment office, and the word was, wow, your handwriting is so beautiful, young Delia. What do you want to do with your life? My mother and my dad, they were the people that wanted to go back, probably in 5 years or 10 years. They just wanted to get a little sum of money to go back to their home. That was the case in my parents. It wasn't everyone's story. A lot of people did run away and never want to go back, but my parents wanted to return. Hey, we've all got choices in life, and this is all it was, choices and ambitions. But that was their locus. That was their framework, their identity, their occupational identity. You can call it social identity. So here we have this kind of geopolitical kind of construct: migration, labor, economy, workforce. You know, around the 50s and 60s, the factories, the electronic factories were booming. Apprenticeships were big, thousands at a time every year taken from schools. You know, the public sector was thriving, National Rail Service, etc., London Transport. You know, so we got manufacturing and we got service sectors all needing a workforce. And the manufacturing was booming. You know, we had the development of electronics. Britain, pioneering electronics industry, needed workers to develop things like radios, televisions, washing machines, and other consumer durables, which were now starting to become a necessity, particularly as we approach the 60s. My dad became a railway shunter for British Rail, worked at Euston. My mum worked in the electronics industry as a factory worker, assembling parts and things like this. So 1974 came. Remember, my parents came in the 1950s, 1974 came, 19, 20 years, mission accomplished. They'd owned a house, had 2 kids, saved a bit of money. It was time to return home. Job done. We're going home. I was 6, my brother was 11, and we returned to the Caribbean. Yes, my friendship networks, when we look back, and my brother's friendship network, that all changed. Now we're going home to family, a hot, uncompromising environment called the Caribbean. When we think of the Caribbean, we think of sunshine, lovely trees, beautiful beaches, sunshine all year round, no winters, you know, a chilled and laid back way of life. But the 70s, Dominica, like many other islands in the Caribbean, relied solely on farming of bananas. We were a small banana export country, so we relied on that. And my parents became farmers. They had small holdings of land. They had a foundation where they were planning to build their home, which they eventually did. With the savings that they amassed, they saved every penny. But in that 2-year period, my mother developed an illness called systemic lupus erythematosus. Later on, she would be the inspiration for my Doctor of Philosophy PhD, and I looked at that autoimmune disease. And basically, the harsh conditions, the working, the toiling in the heat and the sun, acted like a catalyst, really. And her immune system got overrun, and with that, we had to return. And so we became, if you like, new migrants. We returned. When we returned, we were, to all intents and purposes, homeless, because every penny went into trying to build a home out there. And whilst a small apartment got built, we had to leave that behind and come back to Britain. So we were homeless, sleeping, sofa surfing on the floors of relatives, until the London Borough of Brent housed us in a hostel and then eventually in a council flat in the London Borough of Brent, in the poorest part of the borough in terms of probably per head of population in terms of unemployment, but a place where high levels of migrants settled on the housing estates of South Kilburn. South Kilburn, just as a little side note now, generates a series of grime artists like Kronk and all sorts of other grime artists that are really successful. I just say that as a side note. They portray the background, the backdrop of the housing estate today. It represents a kind of a habitus, a space of survival and success for many of the generations that I left behind. But for myself, growing up in a housing estate, that was my habitus, a place where families supported one another. Low-income housing, low-income families on low income from a range of migrant communities, where we found ways to pass the time, stay out of trouble if we could. But the temptations for getting in trouble were really high. Whether it was, breaking into disused cars, whether it was shoplifting and getting told by the shopkeeper, you know what, I've seen you do it, don't do it again. Everybody was a teacher. Everybody was a teacher. The saying, it takes a village to raise a child, is really apt. An old African proverb, but I'm sure manifested in other communities around the globe, even probably Southern Ireland and Cyprus and places where other migrant communities were from. That collective, rather than individualistic backdrop, really drove us as a community to look out for each other and develop friendship networks outside our family networks that became, if you like, extended family networks. So where there was respect for your neighbor, respect for the elders, where polite hellos, thank yous and goodbyes were the order of the day for young children who would see older adults going about their business. You'd see the parents of the children that you went to school with, and you'd always be polite and kind. In fact, when you had free playtime, you would try not to get in trouble with other kids because you knew who their big brother was, their big sister was. There was a hierarchy, a pecking order. So if there was a conflict, the scuffle would soon result in a kind of local justice. It's all done now, isn't it? Yeah, good. Well, sort it out now. There was no prolonged revenge attacks that we see often now with the younger generation in the inner city areas. So I went to school in the housing estate, right smack in the middle, and I excelled at sport, became a brilliant footballer, a child prodigy, and those skills were honed on the streets and the estates, really. And football basically kept me out of trouble because my talent became really good. So 1984, my parents decided, 1983, my parents saved more money. My dad is a cook at this stage, and my mum back in the factories. And her illness abated now. She was a serious outpatient in the rheumatology departments of Northwest London. And many a time I would be her carer, collecting medication, bag loads, 2 bag loads from the chemist, a mixture of steroids, antimalarials, painkillers, you name it, iron tablets. And for a young woman in her 30s and 40s, when I look back now, really overwhelming, really. And growing up in an estate with chronic illness, both parents working, yeah, there probably were tensions in the household. There will be in many working class communities, which Kilburn was. My dad was a trade unionist with in his role as a shop steward, as a caterer. So to some extent, here now is the emergence of my backdrop. I come from a labor household, working class occupation. I'm really proud of that. But I'm going to say it simply. My mother was my prime minister. My mother was my government. My mother was, the person that took us to church. She was the law. And she was sweet too, a listening ear, my social worker, my councillor. And that's the Caribbean household that I'm portraying to you. The national politics really was unwelcoming to migrants. So we're looking at the Conservative Party in the 70s, 80s, you know, they would say harsh things about migrant communities. Things like being swamped by migrants. Fernand Bochner's very seminal book gives a quote of how Thatcher described the idea that if we can't control immigration, you know, locals are going to feel swamped. You know, people seem to forget that again, Britain, I'll come back to it, owned 3/4 of the world. Now, did they buy those countries in a shop, folks? In the chat box, how did they acquire ownership of? I'll start listing: Australia, Kenya, Uganda, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. Let me go on. Let's go to the Caribbean. You know, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Bahamas, Turks Caicos, Antigua, Barbuda. Folks, I'm just talking. I need you to put the chat box. How did Britain acquire ownership? You know, buying a shop? Come in. Darren, feel free to read the chat, please.
I'll wait for people to post in comments, but I've also got some people here in the room. Finley? Yeah, violence, acquired through violence. Yeah, so colonization as well, cited as a reason.
Yes, yes, and
so yeah, Flora says colonization and invasion.
yes, yes, and you know, I like almost to sort of, you know, put a parody of that word colonization. I hear colon, like the you know, now I hear the colon, the intestine, the large intestine of the human organ, because yeah, let's face it, it was as good as that. Now, haven't we got amazing insight that hindsight gives us as an analyst, as political analyst, social science? We can go back in time and look at the forensics of that. But I just took a jaunt back to then bring us forward again. Yeah, because on the one hand, the political message, steeped probably in an ideology of the right, is that this idea of migrants as a little better than just a tool or object, and we must control it, allow them to do what we want them to do, and then manage them in and away. Yes, and yet we still want citizenship in terms of humanity, to be regarded as equals along with all the indigenous and locals. And the flip side is, when Britain saw ownership of their lands, they didn't bring that education back to the locals and say to the people, we raped and pillaged their countries. This is what we owed them. We owed them a debt of gratitude, because while we were doing that, we got fed. We also created jobs for our citizens when we invaded other places, and we gave jobs like the governor and soldiers and managers. We created employment, but now they're here. They're part of the global history. They are our family. Someone forgot to share that. So my political identity, in terms of my occupational identity, is steeped in this notion of my biography, my journey. And now with my scholarly training as an ethnographer, as a social scientist, as an observer, I can see how those things hone my skills as an observer, empirically, as a critical analyst, weighing up the multiple lens of political ideologies and political theories at disposal here. Now, I don't want to overcomplicate it. I think theories can have many layers of levels of complexity in terms of political theory. But you have Thatcher in the 90s, the 70s, 79, 70s and 80s saying these things about migrants. And yet our people, Caribbean people, African, they plow on. Family, work, and family. Yes, hoping for a better tomorrow amidst the other backdrop now, where the government agents on the ground are creating a hostile environment. Okay, another construct which we saw played off in the 2018 period. I'll come on to that. But what I'm talking about is the way in which the police force were poorly and interacting with people of color and migrant communities, particularly people in in the cities like London and Toxteth and Birmingham. We had the death of Colin Roach. Note these names down and Google them up. We had the death of Colin Roach, was a young fellow who was killed in police custody in the 1970s, 80s. Later on, after many years, the family got compensation for death in police custody. We had Sherry Gross, a mother who opened the door to a police raid who were looking for her son, killed in police custody, 1980s, leading to what became the Tottenham riots. Basically, the community were not having it. Yes, the media portrays a lot of black youths setting fire to places. That's criminal damage. But the community, remember this collectivism that I spoke about, yes, earlier on in my housing estate, that was the community at that time. And other litany of death of black people, particularly West Indians, the African too, but the Caribbeans were much more prominent in terms of their resistance to being disrespected by the police, a system, an organization that was supposed to uphold fairness. So another occupational injustice or inhumanity emerging, the very institution designed to protect us. And so again, my political lens is starting to be sharpened in terms of my identity growing up. So I get married, I go to college, I study, I get married, and I settle down in Southend, roughly in the middle of the 1990s. And one evening, my home and the home of many other people gets burgled. And I think I've had enough. I just start knocking doors, finding out, look, what's happened here? Can we help each other? Let's set up a neighborhood watch, please. Let's do something about this. And from that, a neighborhood watch emerged. I was the chair, and we liaised with the police. And then I wanted to know what is it we could do for each other as neighbors to help one another. And that's an amazing kind of local grassroots structure, neighborhood watch committees. So from there, I started to recognize that my job working for the council, some frustrations were starting to emerge with poor institutional practices between my department and another. And I started to say, you know what, if I became a politician, those very rude white professional men would have to respect me, because I was a manager of a team and I was not getting the respect I deserved. My workforce were being undermined because of relationships that I had. And you can imagine, I'm a young 30-year-old now. We're talking about 20 plus years ago. And so guess what, folks? I was strategic. I looked at who ran the council, who were the leading administration, looked at the neighborhood that I lived in, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to join the Conservative Party. They're in power. I want power. I want influence. I'm going to get to know them, and I'm going to be somebody that does not sit by while they say horrible things about black people. That was my mission, to be an insider and an influencer on the inside. They welcomed me with open arms. When I think of a party that had a reputation of not really marketing themselves as a party for migrants, yeah? And we can see the parodies and the plays of that today, how it's manifesting. But they welcomed me with open arms. I joined a committee, worked with other politicians, helped them with local campaigns. I lived in a very affluent ward, by the way, very middle class. And in fact, most of Southend, as you know, for a while, there's been pretty much a tendency to vote Conservative. So it was a sort of a natural home for people that were aspirational and wanted clean streets and things like this, and not much crime in their neighborhood. But I had my goal, and you heard it first off, to be an influence on the inside. Now, it takes an interesting kind of value system. Again, we talk about three things. Volition. My volition was about my drive. Habituation, creating a new norm where I can influence and impact others. Yes. And ultimately performance, how I could combine all those qualities to then perform my role as an activist. And I was an activist for many years. When it came to vacant seats and selection, I was quite strategic as well. I knew the more affluent and successful white candidates would get the strongest seats. And the weaker seats, which were Labour held, i.e., no hope for a Conservative, nobody wanted to really apply for those vacant slots. But I looked at the ward, Curzon ward, and it reminded me of Kilburn, where I was born and bred, more or less. It was home. So when they said, Blaine, there's a slot at Curzon, it was like going home. It's a hard seat, but you never know how it goes. You might, but I knew in my heart I was going to take Curzon because Curzon was home. I grew up in a council flat estate. I ran on the estate with friends, many of whom prison, have done prison time, have murdered, have dead and not with us. So I had the kind of ingredients to match the profile of residents in Curzon. And after 3 years, I got the seat. It was a Labour House seat, and I got it. It was a great time. It was a great time, a real time of success. And it came through hard work and engaging the community, talking to the residents like I spoke to them as a young person growing up in Kilburn. So it was nothing new. But I gave my time and I gave my my effort. I started also to gain a reputation. People started to talk about what my achievements were at Central HQ. This is the Conservative Party headquarters. And soon enough, I was appointed to a role at Conservative Central Office as a it was a social action manager during David Cameron's rise as political leader of the Conservatives. And I started to work with people who are now politicians. I would go to their constituencies, meet them, meet their residents, talk about ways of engaging the communities, much like the way I had engaged in Curzon. But the true essence would have been my background in Kilburn. That was the true ingredients. But it was a range of community projects, and I gave up my time and my resources. I became an advocate. If somebody needed help with an asylum seeker case at the Home Office and they needed a lawyer, I would pay privately from my own money to help someone with no income. Because remember, asylum seekers have no recourse to public funds. We're hearing a lot in the news about asylum seekers now, but can someone comment in the chat box? What does no recourse to public funds mean for an asylum seeker? By the way, we have many in South Essex, Benfleet, and in Southend. Comment in the chat box. What does no recourse to public funds mean?
We'll give people a minute to respond.
Mm-hmm.
So Blaine, some of the contributions here in the room Yeah, that they don't have any citizenship rights, so they don't have access to rights that people who have, you know, residential rights here in the UK have. That means they don't have access to funds to kind of advocate for their own rights. You know, they're underrepresented. Yeah, anyone on the chat want to contribute? Got one person typing at the moment.
Right. Well, so far, this is excellent feedback. Britain is by far a relatively safe place compared to other places around the world. That's why people travel here. So safety is a big thing. It's also a place that has almost a kind of a spirit of humanity and around charity, around fairness. So when people make a trek several thousands of miles away to come here, it's because of the essence of our way of life, which our elders and ancestors have played a part in contributing to this day. And so no recourse to public funds, yes, steeped in our own sort of legislation. That's why we have asylum seekers and then refugees. Britain has been a home for refugees for, let's just say, several hundreds of years. If an asylum seeker gets processed successfully, they will become refugees and have entitlements that any other citizens have. So the real grail, the place to get to, is refugee status. The pre-status is asylum seeker status, in the news recently. Now, if you're an asylum seeker now, you can wait up to several years. Over 50,000 people apparently are being housed in hotels by the Home Office as we speak, waiting up to maybe 5 years. A Refugee Council chairman gave a broadcast yesterday. So me in Kurzel, probably per head of population, with wards, sections that are high on the indices of multiple deprivation, with the top 25% or less of the most poor and deprived areas in Britain. Yeah, the measure of that is the indices of multiple deprivation. And here we have people, migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers needing support. So when I knock on the door and I say, hi, this is who I am, you know, they can't vote anyway. So I could do what a typical politician would do and walk on, all the best, see you later. Or I can still believe in that human being's potential to evolve and be the best person they can be when the opportunities arise. And yes, I spent a lot of time with asylum seekers. So typical things perhaps that maybe a Tory politician wouldn't do. And that would mean sourcing a lawyer. Then a lawyer would take on their case and represent an appeal at the Home Office. These are the type of practical things that I did in terms of casework and engagement. And I engaged with every resident in terms of whoever needed an assistance for something to do with maybe controlled parking zones in their neighborhoods, or the blight of fly tipping, or get involved in engaging the officers to support those residents. So it's a really good conduit between the council and the residents. Help to set up residents associations, because again, through the collective, and I take you back to Blake Court, you know, where I grew up in Northwest London, this idea of collective and community, where everyone's mum was an auntie and everyone's dad was an uncle, and where we would play safely together in the playgrounds or on the balconies of where I grew up. I bring that spirit to my activism. Community activism, community participation, community engagement, the things that really are the essence of who I am, and what I do, or did. And and that was a really great time. when my term ended, I lost by about 100 votes, 150, because remember, it was a Labour seat. And 100 votes, I just make the metaphor, that's like a road worth of voters. So in the run up, you have to go knocking on doors and campaigning to try and win. And I never returned back to politics because I had a belief that I'd done my time. It's someone else's task now. If everyone does their bit, the residents are the only ones that are going to benefit. So it wasn't about self-serving my career to climb up the political ladder. It was to do my role. And I'm really proud of a few things. Proud that I got to know amazing people in Kersal, probably the poorest ward in Southend, one of them by unemployment or and other indicators. I got to give and help a lot of people. And I got to learn about myself and develop new talents, skills, and experiences. Um, and look at time now. I'm able to meet with a group of young people and share some of the essence of who I am and the type of skills that I develop to help other people. And I'd encourage anybody to get into a career in politics and believe in the change that you're capable of making to affect a civic society, a fair society. Sometimes you have disagreements with your colleagues and you have to hold strong on principles when there are disagreements. Because that affects you. What do I mean? On one occasion, I think there was a decision. It would have been around the time of the 2010 government administration. So we're hearing about cuts. I was elected in 2008 to 2012. So by the time the Conservative coalition government came in 2010, you know, the chorus of cuts affecting the NHS and local councils happening all. And one such measure I think I had to do or agree to was that my ward where I lived, where I represented, we'd have to cut the free grant, the grant to fund school uniforms. Darren, can you believe it? And they're expecting me to vote to agree to that. So I was proud to say, no, I'm voting against my leaders. They were in furore. Oh, we're unhappy. Never do that in future. Abstain is much better. No way. No way. The poorest kids in the borough are in the ward I represent. They let them have a free school uniform. Like, find it from somewhere else. Let someone else, earn £1,000 less. Be someone on 150 grand a year. Just earn 149,000. Let's pay for free school uniform for the most deprived kids in the borough. So anecdotal now, but with logic, you stand by that. There are things I couldn't help. They brought in a policy called the bedroom tax. It meant that it was a way that obviously they're trying to generate income. That's the message. So people whose children had flown a nest, but those people were still living in a large accommodation that once housed their family of, 4 or 5, whatever, or 6 or more. So if it's a single person living in a 3-bedroom dwelling, they would apply a tax to those other 2 bedrooms. And so I was going to lose that election because many of those people who probably wouldn't have voted Conservative voted for me the previous 3 or 4 years. So here I come knocking on the door a few years later saying, hi, will you? Sorry, Blaine, we just can't do it. We can't stand what your government's done. And it's impacting us. So it's nothing on you, Blaine, but we just can't do it. I didn't believe that I could talk for so long about my without slides or a lesson plan.
But it would be also great as well, like to hear from some of the people as well on Teams and in the room, if they have any particular questions as well for you, Blaine, about your background, because that was really interesting, your experiences coming to Britain and experiencing the structural racism of the 70s and 80s, and we see like really strong echoes of that again today. The report into the Metropolitan Police, highlighting institutional racism, for example. Or if people would like to ask questions about, your experiences as a councillor, if you had any guidance or any tips, because we've got some people here that would like to be public servants in the future. Or maybe, yeah, I'll just open to the floor if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask. And on Teams, you can put your questions into the chat box and I'll read them out to Blaine as well. Anyone here? Okay. So Davidas is asking, like, why not run as an MP? I mean, did you ever have that aspiration? Surely becoming councillor is a step towards, representing a constituency.
Yes, at one point I was on the parliamentary list. I was on the list to become an MP, and I think I applied for a seat in Brent East, where I was from. So the Conservatives took me. I applied, became a candidate, and so I was on the list for a few years. But I made a decision to move away from that. I'd done my stint, and I began to realize politics is a very stressful thing, a very demanding environment. Just when I became elected, social media was taking off. But if I had to become a politician today, you need about 5 people who are managing your social media for a living. Without that, the online mud can get so painful. You can ignore it, but the traffic is so high. So you need a team to manage your search engine optimization and to deal with the online campaign, because invariably your political opponents will have an online campaign delegated through other agencies whose prime job is to undermine you. So for now, that's my lesson to you. If you wanted to become a politician, you need an online presence and people that are going to be managing that the online activity for you. So, in my day, it was just leaflets. In your days now, all your social media interfaces need to be on time, managed well, and rebuttals ready for rebuttals. I saw Blaine, he dropped a hanky in the street, terrible. Another person saying, I know Blaine, he picks it up, he put it in the bin. Yeah, you got to be ready to be on it. Next questions. We see a question in the chat box. What are your thoughts?
This is a good question, Blaine, because I think a lot of people might have had like a bombshell moment when you talk about your background, but then joining the Conservative Party. But you explained quite well your reasons for joining the Conservative Party. But Flora's asking, what are your feelings about the Conservative Party today?
Well, I see, again, a party that has recruited talented people from all walks of life, and probably, a party that's got representation from various minority ethnic communities in leadership roles. Now, that's like a dream, I want to one day become maybe a professor or something like that. Why not? For many people in jobs of colour, our appointment and competition for roles is much more difficult than other people of other colours. So the Conservatives have got some anomalies of success. But I have to be honest, I believe the leadership, people like Home Office, etc., they're much more draconian and much more colonial than the colonialists. They're harsh and inhumane rhetoric. You wouldn't think that people like the Home Office Minister originate from the third world. Do you know what I mean? And I think they've got origins in Brent, where I was from as well. And there's many other examples, and other leaders speaking about racism in a way. Well, it doesn't exist anymore in Britain. You know, that kind of mentality almost. Once again, a kind of they fall in a role and become an automaton, a messenger for the right, because their constituents will be happy with those messages, and those messages seem inhumane. As a country, we need a workforce to help us survive, just as we did when my parents came, just as we did in the late 1800s when the Irish came here to do all the dirty work. Talk to me, Darren.
Well, indeed, you know, I mean, well, we had to move over in more recent times because of the economic crash in 2008. But yeah, a lot of our underdevelopment is due to British colonialism. You know? We became the granary of Britain. Our economy was based on agriculture to feed the working classes in Britain. So yeah, you know, we started, even when we got political independence, we're still at a massive disadvantage, you know, in relation to other economies across Europe. But yeah, you know, we see labour shortages today, Blaine, and if we do shut the door on immigration, how are we going to fill those positions? We got low birth rates as well, as you know, in occupational therapy. So something has to give, right?
And what will give is the young people today with a reasonableness. You know, these guys are going to become MPs. They're going to be sitting with people who have a privileged mentality from eating. So they've got their own challenges to break. You know, in as much as they might have a white privilege, actually, there's a social class-ism that is also hovering around, such a status orientated at the upper middle class level. And hopefully that will change when you think of, you know, the forensic evidence of colonialism. You know, we've got a big stately home here in Leeds, Harewood House. You know, they are descendants of slavers, and the wealth built that. But now they're saying we're actually now trying to do a reparatory justice. We're trying to do much more education and paying back for the atonements of our forefathers. We've got education workshops, this, that, and the other. So this is a semblance of humanity that is needed in democracy. What the Conservatives like to say is that we make all the tough decisions. And I know being a politician is a lot more about making decisions to do with things like foreign affairs and things like the war abroad and things like this. Let me read out another question. It says, what are your feelings about the Labour Party and the other major political parties? Well, I learned about the Lib Dems during the coalition, that they were actually a very socialist party. I never really knew that before. So that means more tax, and trying to not level up, but distribute wealth. Labour, I love the notion, but they came after me and campaigned hard. So, you know, I've got some personal scars from Labour, even though I grew up in the housing estate in Kilburn with a dad who was a trade unionist, etc. When I look back, I like Tony Blair's messaging, but towards the end, I felt, you know, I was a bit put off by the weapons of mass destruction, which were never found. But I liked his flair. I liked how he came and he rebranded and to gain some of the Tory voters in order to beat John Major. So a real strategic nous there. I like the idea of welfare spending and welfare investment, and that comes through, unfortunately for those who don't like the Tories, it comes through, if you like, the multiplier effect. Exports. If we can sell our products abroad, we can get money coming in. Yes, if we get money coming in, we can invest in education, schools, roads, things like this. But if we don't have enterprise and people making money out of nothing, we'll just have the same money swirling around the economy and occasionally go to the bank and just print more money, just print more money, just print more. Folks, what happens if you just keep printing? Then it will make money will be. What's the problem if you just keep asking the bank of England just to print more? What's the problem with that, folks?
There's a great question here from Jason. Have you seen it?
Jason says, do you think there is a large flaw in the Conservative ideal or from the selected members who are in power today? No, because their flaw to us is power to them. Every day they're in office, they're a success. You know, if their message is cuts for 20 years, misery for us, you know, remember Tony Blair, feel good politics. You want to step out, yes, you feel good, yes, sure start, isn't that lovely? A bit of business here and there. But when on the Conservatives, this feel good thing, it's not there. So that's the flaw. But for them, every day in power is success. So you know what? Good luck to them. That's their modus operandi. Sell misery. The papers love it. Across the front, say a few horrible things about migrants. The far right will clap their hand. Now, notice all of a sudden we don't have UKIP anymore, or the BNP, or the National Front. You know, the message has been kind of hoovered up by the right. You know what I mean? Under one banner UK. Yeah, and say some horrible things about migrants. And then it gets people in the with that thinking being happy, celebrating. Yes, that's great, but it's not human. Yeah, when we go to their countries, we live like kings in if you like, kings and queens in enclaves or expat communities. We don't think for a minute about about the feelings or it has on the as it trickles down. But you're right, Jaden, again, inflation. Do you support proportional representation? Looking back now, I kind of voted against it when I was an activist, but with respect, it makes a lot of sense-ish. It makes a lot of sense because we can get a broad spectrum of values in our chambers. Yeah, broad spectrum. Yeah.
Yeah, how would you judge political discourse today compared to the 90s, 80s, 70s? And I mean political discourse in a general sense, including Conservatives and Labour, like just the overall quality of debate.
I think today you can't pull the wool over the eyes easily of the members of the public now. I don't think you can do that. I think everybody at the touch of a button can get information and find out what they need to do. If an MP knocks on their door and says, "Would you vote for me at the next election?" You could quickly look at how many votes they've done. I think pandemic threw a lot up because we began to see what these people are doing for us who are getting paid. I think the people we don't see much of are the local councillors and local politicians. That type of activism is so important to hold those people to account at local authority level. It's so important, so important. And yet they get squeezes from central government in terms of their instructions too. So the level of debate is very polarized now. Yeah, it's left and right, it's Conservatives, and then it's Labour. And then you've got the media undermining people like Corbyn and now Keir starting, you know what I mean? So it then creates a kind of a success vacuum again for the Conservatives. So long as you've got Labour being accused of anti-Semitism, they hate Jews. Wow, they're never going to be voted again. So long as that taint is with them. God knows what that means, but the media and a few insiders want justice for what that means. But what a thing to have to fight off. We fought the Nazis to defeat that anti-Semitism, and in our British politics, the idea that it exists, it's just unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. But there's a lot of hate and ignorance in the Conservative Party, but their level of prejudice gets covered over. The other day, a politician said the most horrible thing about Ian Wright supporting Gary Lineker. The most horrible thing, but the media don't say anything. That just gets blown away. Well, that's horrible. So the media play a lot in this.
And I think we'll take one more question. We have Jaden. Do you support increased devolution to the nations and English regions?
It sounds really great, doesn't it? But the first devolution is go and find out who your local politician is in your local area, join them, become active, and let them sweat for your vote locally. Do you know what I mean? Become a local politician, get local. We want that. But young people today, they've got other things to do with their time. But you know, local politics is so important. It's the vehicle to it's the connection between local and national, and you can hold your local member of parliament to account when you're a local politician. You meet him or her at meetings, you can network, you can, you know, you can get up to Westminster with a group of residents. Do you know what I mean? Hold him to account, and you're like, oh my God, he's brought 10 residents. Yes, he have. We want to see what you do for the money that we you know, you get paid, you know.
Okay, one more question then for, oh, just something to say? Yeah, okay, Douglas.
So I grew up and I went to school in Dagenham, which is in northeast London. And I really feel how you're expressing like the community spirit. Because when we were going to primary school, it was just everyone. It was such an inclusive community. Friendly competition, sailing.
That's good to hear.
Absolutely positive memories from that period of time.
Okie dokie. We're 5 minutes over, so thanks everyone for your patience. And Dr. Blaine Robin, thanks again for your time.
Thank you very much.
What a pleasure.
I really appreciate this. I really appreciate this.
Oh, we really appreciate you giving up your time and to share your experience. It's been really, really fun and interesting. And
thank you.
Yeah, lots of positive feedback in the comments as well. I
was always wanting us to do something like this many years ago, Darren. Remember when we were in FE?
Well, we'll do more of it in the future, definitely.
But if I can get this, my biography or this essence published, I will. That's why I'm interested in the transcript. But the video would also help. I can disseminate that as well if it's with the permission of your students, if they agree.
Definitely, Blaine. No problem at all. Okay. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
All the best, young people. All the best, young people. Good luck.
Bye.
Thank you, Darren. Bye now.
Bye.
Okay. Nice way to end the day.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Don't forget to fill in the forms as well. Thank you.
I thought we were going to finish at 1:30.